Ah, perfect. All right, there's Jack, the star of the show. Yeah, it's good to see you, Jack. I
Thank you.
think it's been, yeah, almost 10 years that we've seen each other. You were off and on in the Netherlands, and we talked about SUDS, or sustainable urban drainage systems, or water urban sensitive design, probably as you call it at your site. But yeah, it's great to
Yep.
have you here, especially at this time because you're now in Australia. So yeah, in
Yeah.
the middle
Well,
of the night.
yeah. Forgive me if I look tired or anything of that nature, but yeah.
Yeah, no, all fine. Yeah, we're really excited to hear about what you want to tell us in this Climate Cafe online. So yeah, you prepared some slides, and then we can have some Q&A after. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay. Cool. Well, that being the case, I'll quickly share my screen, and we can get into it. Also, we're just going to move that over so we can go full screen. Okay. Can you see my screen okay there?
Yes, nice, thanks.
Awesome. Okay. So look, um, couple of bits of context. Yes, I'm based in Brisbane, Australia. I've worked in kind of the stormwater, water sensitive urban design world uh, since about 2010, although I did take a bit of a break from the industry for a while, took a tangent, opened a gym, but I've come back into this space now. And my passion has always been around stormwater treatment assets like bioretention or biofiltration systems, how we make that technology work in a sustainable way over the long term. So what I hope to tell you all about tonight, from my point of view, is just some recent thinking about biofiltration systems that's at least relevant in Queensland here. To do this, I'm going to give you a little bit of just background and context, and then we'll dive into it. Do forgive me, there is a very small chance that my 7-year-old daughter might wake up, and if that happens, I will have to dive off briefly, but hopefully that
Sure.
doesn't happen. So, okay, Queensland perspective on biofiltration. Context here. This is Queensland. It's the northeastern part of Australia. It's very large. I live in Brisbane, which is the major city in Queensland, but we do have coastal major population centres all up the coast, spanning, hundreds of kilometers up the coast. I work for an organization called Water by Design. So we are what in Australia is termed a capacity building organization. So it's our job to try and build capacity and knowledge to support the implementation of water sensitive urban design. So this means we run training, we try and facilitate research and policy development, and we also publish guidelines that guide a lot of this stuff. I'll mention at least one of those later on. If by any chance you find this really interesting and want to kind of stay in touch with what we do have a newsletter that you can sign up for on our website. When I talk about water sensitive urban design, we can actually mean quite a lot of things here, but just a couple of pictures to put in your mind is that we can mean a couple of things. Top right corner there, we've got a stormwater harvesting wetland. So it's treating stormwater runoff. This is in Adelaide in South Australia. And then storing it and reusing it to water the botanic gardens that surround it. We can mean stormwater treatment just for its own sake. So the bottom right picture there is a bioretention system, biofiltration. But we can also just mean like making better use of water in the urban landscape to make better urban places. So we have a constructed waterway here. There's good interaction, good for kids to play in and this sort of thing. So just setting some context here. From a policy point of view, we have since early days 2006, but much more commonly since about 2010, we have had some stormwater treatment objectives that essentially apply that when new development happens, so residential subdivisions, this sort of thing, these developments have to meet certain stormwater treatment targets, and they're set out in a document called the State Planning Policy. But a little bit down the track, when I talk about us having lots of biofiltration systems, in Queensland, they are primarily driven by this document there. And people use software like Music to demonstrate their compliance with those objectives, determine what stormwater treatment systems they want to implement. And I mentioned guidelines before. There are a suite of guidelines published by us at Water by Design to support the implementation of things like bioretention, biofiltration, and the like. What this means is that over the past, particularly 15 years or so, but out to, 20, 25 years at a stretch, there have been a lot of stormwater treatment measures installed in Queensland. They have, because of this policy, largely been bioretention systems. There are some degree of proprietary stormwater treatment products like underground systems being installed, and a small number of stormwater treatment wetlands. And so it's because of this that I'll talk about some biofiltration, bioretention thoughts tonight. But it's worth recognizing that when we talk about the bigger picture of water sensitive urban design that I mentioned before, that includes a whole suite of stuff that we're not implementing anywhere near as regularly. And this is a discussion for another day. Maybe I'll, angling to come back on sometime. But there's a whole really interesting discussion here about how the big picture water sensitive urban design dream includes all this stuff about landscape integration and different methods of managing stormwater and the water cycle more generally. But because in Queensland, we have primarily attempted to drive water sensitive urban design through a relatively discrete set of objectives that primarily apply to treating stormwater from new developments, as a result, we have somewhat accidentally incentivized only a few different WUSD measures as a response. And there's a whole interesting discussion that can be had about, well, okay, how should that policy be reshaped to try and incentivize the whole package? But that's not my point today. The main point here is we built a darn lot of bioretention systems. To give an example of this is a little map that I created years ago. This is just for Southeast Queensland here, that shows tons and tons of different stormwater treatment systems in Southeast Queensland. The orange dots are almost exclusively bioretention systems there. There are lots of them. Some of this is on the ClimateScan map as well. Years ago, Floris and I imported some of this on there. Maybe in the future we'll import the current lot here. To give you another indication of just how many biofiltration systems we have in Southeast Queensland, there are 8 local governments in SEQ: Gold Coast, Logan, Ipswich, Redland, Brisbane, Moreton, Sunshine Coast, Noosa. I'll say that again. Sorry, 8 really urban local governments. There are other local governments, but they're more rural, but there's 8 really urban ones. One of them, I won't tell you which one, but for example, that local government has somewhere around 1,500 publicly owned biofiltration systems. And that's not including privately owned assets. That's not including other treatment types, etc. Another local government in SEQ owns somewhere around 800. So you can quickly do some back of the envelope maths and realize that there's probably in the order of about 8,000 of them just in Southeast Queensland. Just presenting the picture that we have lots of the darn things. So just quickly, in case anyone doesn't know what I mean by biofiltration, can come at a whole bunch of different scales. I'll go back to that diagram in a tick. But it is vegetated depressions in the landscape that we direct water into. Water filters vertically down through a soil profile and is probably collected at pipes in the bottom and discharged. It can happen at a whole bunch of scales. In this case, it's this big system, big planted bed here, like so. Just to give you a cross-section of it, we see the profile here. So the main parts are, there is some kind of stormwater inlet to the system, not shown in this diagram. But then we have a filter media in brown. We have a transition sand in yellow. We have drainage gravel at the base in grey. And we have some slotted pipes running through that drainage gravel to some kind of outlet overflow pit, and then a stormwater pipe out the end. And so the whole point here is that we are attempting to direct water into the system, potentially out to pond on the surface a little bit, and have it infiltrate down through the filter media, through the sand, into the gravel, into the pipes and out. And treatment occurs through a combination of physical, chemical and biological processes enabled by the filter media and the plants. Again, just setting basic context, and then I'll talk about where our current thinking is at on this stuff. So just so you can picture this, we have a whole bunch of different scales, from really big systems like this one here, right down to really small little systems that might be better termed as rain gardens, like this one here. It's receiving some roof water and some surface water off a multi-unit development into this little area here. You can have them in long bioretention swale type setups, like out front of this industrial development. Another bioretention swale, but at a smaller scale, accepting some runoff from a road. This would be what I'd term a bioretention basin, so several hundred square meters. There's a waterway running in the background here. Urban development is out of shot to the right there, so it's a residential subdivision. Streetscape bioretention, that's an interesting site. Might come back and talk about that later, but so on, a whole bunch of different scales. And sometimes it's not built very well at all. I won't dwell on this a heap, but I showed you all the pretty pictures here. Lovely, well vegetated and the like. We have had our fair share of muck-ups over the years of, terrible plant establishment, terrible urban design. This doesn't integrate into the landscape. Hilarious story about how this hole in the ground got built and the like. But I just want to recognize, system that looks like a plug hole in a bath. Just want to recognize that while there are many good assets we can point to, there we have in the process built a lot of rubbish that we've learnt from. And I would suggest there is less of this stuff getting built these days, but we have to recognize we've made mistakes. And even stuff as simple mistakes as this, where you have what could be an otherwise quite good little streetscape bioretention system here, but it's somewhere maybe like last minute in the approvals process, someone went, there's a footpath and there's a little drop into the system. We couldn't possibly have that drop there. We better fence it. And so we end up with a pool fence around what could otherwise, if it had a few more plants in it, have been a pretty good system. Anyway, so let's get on to some contemporary thinking about this. I just wanted to say all of that primarily to set the landscape so you understand, one, why we're building so many biofiltration systems, and it's because we've set some policy for stormwater treatment objectives, and two, just understand the sheer quantity of assets that we have built in Queensland over time. And when I say we, that's the collective we for the whole industry, not we as in water by design. So I want to share with you 3 lessons that we've learned over time here that might be of use. And so the first one's around what I term surprising resilience. So I want to introduce you to the Hoyland Street bioretention system. So this is a bioretention system in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. It's this treed area here. I believe in total it's around 600 or 800 square meters in size. But you can see its depression in the landscape. There's a stormwater pipe coming into it from the other end. This photograph's taken from the bottom end. And there's an outlet pit kind of where I'm hovering the cursor just there at the moment. Now, what's really interesting about this system is that it was built in 2001. It is the second oldest bioretention system in Australia. There's one that was built in Melbourne, Victoria, several months before this one. But then Brisbane City Council built this one in 2001. And that means it's 25 years old now. So we have a fair sense of what might happen over time in a system like this. Now, I first visited it in 2010 here. So this photograph is taken in 2010, where it was already, 9 years old, a relatively well-established system there. And at the time, if we went and had a closer look in it, we'd see it was a really well-vegetated system resembling a little pocket of bushland. Some good dense canopy, if we zoom back out, understory species throughout, lots of leaf litter on the surface if you look closely between the understory plants there. And if we now skip forward to some photos taken in 2026, the system is far from perfect. I'm going to point out some faults in it in a minute. But it's still, when we talk about the key functional attributes of bioretention here, it's still doing really, really well in spite of some obvious flaws. And I also know from speaking to people who understand what has and hasn't been done maintenance-wise to this system over time is that it has largely been neglected throughout its entire life from a maintenance point of view. So in the system here, if we get a little closer there, we can see that these days it has changed a fair bit. The understory is a fairly weedy mess there, and the canopy has thinned over time. Because if I just skip back a second here, we fundamentally had two species of trees in it in 2010. The white-barked species here, Melaleuca quinquenervia. This is a paperbark tree, so native Australian tree, really lovely, beautiful tree, beautiful bark. And then the darker barked species is a species of acacia. Acacias being a pioneer that hop up but live a relatively short lifespan. So one of the things that changed in this system was the acacias. The acacias reached the end of their life and died somewhere around 2015 or thereabouts, and the canopy thinned and more weeds got in. But in spite of this, in spite of the neglect it's had, in spite of the fact that it's weedy, we can say some things really clearly about it, which is stormwater still gets into the system. The filter media is evidently still very porous, so water's able to get through it. And we do still have good plant coverage in the system, even if a lot of that is weed cover. And it's those three functional attributes that, short of doing some actual water quality monitoring on the system, which is obviously very desirable, but also very expensive, it's those three attributes that you can, from a condition assessment point of view, look at and be like, pretty good indication that this is still doing pretty well. So, and we have, obviously, this is, the oldest system that I have easy access to and a long photo record of. But as more and more systems age, we are seeing this pattern repeat, where so long as the system is built and established well in the first instance, they are remarkably resilient. Obviously, it would have been better if there had been some more maintenance on this, if those weeds had been controlled, even through the tiniest little bit of regular maintenance throughout the years. But there's a lesson here that, look, even in the face of a fair bit of neglect, we can do pretty well. One of the reasons this is really important is that in Queensland, we are doing a lot of this stormwater treatment for the protection of our local waterways, creeks, rivers, bays, this sort of thing. And the science really does show that if we want to make a meaningful difference to that, we have to implement stormwater management measures on really quite a wide scale. It means building an awful lot of this stuff. And in the early days of implementing biofiltration systems, we just weren't sure how long they would last. And so if you've got this kind of thought process of like, wow, we have to build an awful lot of this stuff, and we actually don't know how long it's like, is this filter media going to clog up after 10 or 15 years? How on earth are we going to afford not only to build all the new stuff we need to build, but then to fix up the stuff that might be clogging after 15 years? That's a really confronting problem. So then to see systems that, even in the face of a lot of neglect, still continue to drain and support vegetation 25 years later, that's a positive story. It might not be the perfect outcome, but it's not terrible there. And hence that's the first lesson here, that they present surprising resilience even in the face of neglect, so long as you build them and establish them right in the first instance. The second lesson here is that maintenance of biofiltration systems at scale is possible, but it takes work. It's not super easy, but it is possible. So I want to bring you back to this diagram, or this image of the local governments in Southeast Queensland. As I mentioned, there's kind of 8 urban local governments. And if we go back to about 15 years, in 2010, when I joined the industry, to the best of my knowledge, either none or maybe one of them had a dedicated budget for maintenance of stormwater treatment assets. And that was largely because it was still a really new asset class. There just hadn't been a big reason to implement a budget. In fact, the whole way I got into the industry was I finished university in 2010. And my final bit at university was I got a student placement with Logan City Council, this one here that's immediately south of Brisbane. And my job was they had been they had been requiring stormwater treatment assets to be built on new development for 3 or 4 years at that point, but hadn't developed an asset register or anything like that. My job was literally to go back through the records, figure out where all these stormwater treatment assets were, do a condition inspection of them, and then have a panic attack about what that might mean for maintenance. But the point is, my entry into the industry was literally the first steps at trying to get a maintenance budget for this stuff. So in 2010, none or maybe one of the councils had a budget for maintenance. But 15 years later, of these 8 councils, all of them now have some semblance of a budget for maintenance of biofiltration assets. Now, the quantum of that money is not enough to look after all of their assets, but it is a good start. So, for example, the local government that I mentioned that has about 1,500 bioretention systems currently maintains 800 of them to a pretty good standard there. So I look at that and go, okay, this isn't perfect, but in that period, we've made a really substantial improvement in what we're doing here. We have a lot of work to go because, again, as I said, we have to, if we want to achieve the environmental goals that are our outcome here, we do have to implement this on such a wide scale that eventually it might make 1,500 systems look like a drop in the ocean, but this is the goal. So the second lesson here is, as I said, that getting to this point where we have maintenance budgets at a large scale is doable. And fundamentally, in most cases, all the local governments have gone through pretty much a similar process to get there, which is to say, they went and identified first whatever assets they had already been built in the ground. So they created an asset register. Doesn't have to be formal, doesn't have to go into their, formal asset management system. You just need a list of here's what it is and here's where it is. They did a condition inspection of it. And those 2 bits of data really frame up the problem. Because when there's a new asset type and a local government needs to maintain it, what will happen is people will start to get a sense for, okay, there's this thing, there's this problem, we need budget for it. But because no one's really funded to look at the problem well, to invest a lot of time thinking about it, the problem remains amorphous and hard to put your finger on, hard to understand. So you can't quite grapple with it. But as soon as you've mapped all the assets and done a condition inspection, it might be confronting and you might have a little panic attack over it, but it brings the problem into focus and allows you to tackle it. And so from there, then the various stakeholders within an organization like a local government can come together and use that information to work out a way forward. How are we going to make a business case for a maintenance budget? How do we figure out which department should actually be responsible for those assets and so on? So I'd strongly encourage, if there's anyone with any asset base that's new and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, those 2 first steps of create an asset register, do a condition assessment, are the key to start. And just as a point here, this is a picture of an asset that is on the maintenance regime of that local government I mentioned before, just to kind of validate that, hey, they're doing a pretty decent job keeping them in okay condition. And this brings me to my third and final lesson that I'd like to share with you, which is that if we treat biofiltration systems more like ecosystems and less like gardens, it makes maintenance easier and it makes the systems more resilient. So, for a long time in Australia, we built biofiltration systems and planted them primarily with understory plants and in a manner that kind of resembled a garden here. So the picture in the top left was a picture that I took somewhere in 2010 when I went and did those first condition inspections for Logan City Council. And we found this system that was in pretty good nick at the time. All understory plants, inlet at the far end, outlet pit just here in the foreground, water filters down through the system into pipes to the outlet pit, etc. But gradually, over time, the system just went through this pattern that we now see play out over and over again, where when you try and treat it like a garden with only understory plants, at least in our climate, weeds get into the system. You end up chasing your tail, trying to manage the weeds. Eventually, someone comes in and sprays herbicide around and accidentally kills a whole bunch of the desirable plants, except for the really tough ones. Can you see between, say, this top middle photo and this top right photo? There's one species that's surviving. Shock horror, that's, the species that is really tough and really resilient to herbicide. And so we were just seeing systems go through this pattern of well vegetated, some weeds get in, oops, they start to take over. Oops, maybe they get sprayed out inadvertently. Now we have gaps all around the vegetation, which makes it easier for more weeds to get in. And if that pattern repeats, eventually you end up with a system that's essentially devoid of vegetation there. But what we discovered over time is that there's also these really quite large number of hidden assets that no one really knew about because they were just ticking along nicely. And so not getting any attention, but continuing to perform really well. And what sets all of those assets apart is that they have been planted more like a pocket of bushland that behaves like a more complete ecosystem. So this particular site, I got taken to by a fellow, Jonas Larsen, who's got a real interest in ecology and soil science, and he is the asset manager for a local government in Southeast Queensland. He took me to this site last year and showed it to me, and it was like, look at this, look at all these trees. We do zero maintenance on this apart from picking a little bit of litter out of it and cleaning some sediment out of the inlet. He's like, we do not do anything else to this asset. And he took me to it. And by dumb luck, I was like, I visited this site 15 years ago, and it was like any other site at the time. It had just been planted out. You would expect it to have followed the pattern of any other site, except for the one decision, which is, as well as the understory species, they planted a bunch of these casuarina trees in it. And so over time, as the casuarinas established a canopy, they have helped suppress the weed growth. Now, casuarinas are particularly good at this because they are allelopathic, so they do make it tough for other species to grow underneath them, but the lomandras can survive it. And so what we fundamentally have going on here, okay, I'll come back. What we fundamentally have going on is a couple of things, but I'll show you another site first. This is a picture of another site here that, again, exhibits these same sorts of properties, treating it a bit more like bushland rather than a garden bed. Another example here with really like dense tree and shrub planting in it. All of these systems are much, much, much cheaper to maintain and more resilient. It's not to say that this is the planting style we should do in all situations. This clearly isn't appropriate if you have a little streetscape bioretention system in a high-density urban development. But a large quantity of the bioretention that we are implementing in Queensland is at this basin scale of several hundred square meters. And at that scale, this is appropriate, and it's way cheaper to maintain. And so it achieves this fundamentally through a couple of processes. This is an aerial photograph of this basin here. So this basin is this aerial photograph. When you get a canopy up above the system, we have far more shade on it, and weeds find it far, far, far harder to propagate in the system. Another aerial photograph of a different bioretention system there. When you have trees in a bioretention system, you get leaf litter on the surface, just like in a forest. Like that, the leaf litter helps to suppress weed growth. The casuarina needles here are particularly good at it, again, because casuarinas are allelopathic, but it does happen with other species. And number three is it gradually makes the filter media more hospitable to plant growth over time. So at least in Australia, filter media that we install in bioretention systems is a pretty tough environment to get plants to really thrive in. It's pretty sandy. We call it a sandy loam, but, it's sand with a bit of loaminess. But as soon as you have a system with canopy and you have the leaf litter forming on the surface, we start to get breakdown of that. We have organics form on the surface. We start to develop an O horizon, just like you'd expect to in any bushland there. And that gradually changes the filter media. Then in this shot is the really quite white sandy color. It gradually improves the surface layer of that and makes it more hospitable to plants. It's also far cooler in these systems. If you go to a system that has only understory plants, it gets pretty hot here, particularly in summer. You'll find the filter media really looks and feels like a baked surface. If you try and kick into it with your foot, it'll be really hard to kick into. It'll be baked hard. You go to a system with the same filter media in it that has canopy and some leaf drop in it, the surface will be soft. You can kick into it, no worries. So there's all this stuff that, treating systems less like gardens and more like ecosystems just helps them to be so much more resilient and the plants to be much, much healthier and happier, like so. And so I suppose to summarize there, 3 lessons. 1, biofiltration systems have been surprisingly resilient over time, so long as you build and establish them well in the first instance. We're making progress on doing maintenance at scale. We're not totally there yet, but compared to 15 years ago, where there was no maintenance of this happening, because it was a very small asset base, we've made massive progress. And if we want to reduce costs of at least the basin type systems of several hundred square meters or so, treat them like an ecosystem, not like a garden. It'll make a massive difference to costs. Cool. And that's the end of what I had prepared.
Nice. Yeah.
Where to from here, guys?
No, but these, great lessons, and also, we had a lot of talks quite some time ago, but I never realized actually that we're in the same transition. And as you have the first implementation like 2001, the Netherlands was about 1999. So it's the same transition as you showed. There's massive implementation now of bioretention. And also, as you say, it's a fraction of maybe what we have to do in the future. So, and a massive task of maintenance. Well, I don't have to remind Sydney on that, working at a municipality. I mean, that's huge. You have to prioritize and be smart about it as well. So that's now a great lesson. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe no, or maybe Charnay or Sydney first as questions or reflections.
We don't have to go in order, so just go ahead.
Yeah. Now, well, you talk about maintenance, and when you say maintenance, mostly you say the weed should be controlled, or is there also other things that is regarded as maintenance, like flushing pipes, or what do you mean with maintenance? What will be?
Yeah.
And of course, it's different every location, but what is maintenance for your side?
Yeah. So look, the way it seems to have settled out for most of the local governments here is that the 3 most common activities that are just programmed regular, do it on a regular basis are weed management, litter management, and removing sediment. So in our climate, it seems like the most cost-effective way to manage weeds is to do a little bit very regularly. So some of the most proactive local governments, for example, for the assets that they are able to maintain, they're visiting them roughly every 4 weeks to do weed control and to pick litter out of the system there. And then they have a sediment removal run roughly twice a year. So a lot of contemporary biofiltration design will have a concrete sediment forebay near the inlet to the system, maintenance access track down to it to try and make that collection as easy as possible. So they're the 3 activities that are kind of programmed and regular. And then obviously there is responsive works that might be done from time to time. But they're the big 3. I know of one local government, for example, that has a rolling program of at least checking the under drainage pipes. So in most of our systems, we have the pipes along the base and then an upturn that comes to the surface as like an inspection point. The way that this local government is doing it is for a portion of its asset base every year. They send a water truck out and they just pour some water down every one of the clean out points sequentially and observe the outlet to see if they get water from each of them. And if they get water, they go, okay, it's at least partially draining. We're happy with that. And if they find any that just water doesn't return out of, then that triggers them to do a follow-up inspection with a CCTV camera, like so. That's not a widespread practice, but there's at least one local government doing that.
Yeah, indeed. So that's quite, similar as well. And then, a bunch of things, maybe also 3 points that I would make. So I made one. And then, the second one, is about mapping, or a mutual hobby, I would say. And indeed, very important. If you don't know where they are, you don't know what to do or to prioritize for maintenance. But then, so that's only in the public or what is the maintenance for the local government, right? So you don't map any on private property.
Some of the local governments do have some maps of what's on private property. I cannot speak for all of them, but I know that some do. But also that those maps might be incomplete. So they've kind of been made on more of a sporadic basis. But the honest answer is we have not done anywhere near enough to begin to tackle the issue of maintenance of assets on private property. There's a little bit
you don't
that
have
goes
to,
on.
Right? Yeah.
But it's also a case of, I mean, you can think about this in a number of different ways, but one way to think of it is that we really should get our own house in order before we go and try and regulate private. If you're the local government who has a whole bunch of their own assets and is the regulator of what might happen on private property, you really should get your own house in order first before you go telling other people what to do. But the one thing that has been done a fair bit in recent years proactively is that when assets are built on private property, there's often conditions attached to the approval of development that require that the asset is retained and maintained. So if a local government were to down the track create a compliance program, there's at least some head of power there that says, okay, this thing you built does actually still have to be there. So, but in terms of actually going out and proactively inspecting assets on private property, little or no action on that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, big challenge also here, of course. And maybe then the third point before I give it over to Shanae and Sydney. So it will be great. We don't have time to go in all the guidelines that you have, but it will be very interesting. Of course, you have been in the Netherlands. Have seen some systems we visited, from water squares to bioretention, etc. Is there something that stands out from your memory, things that could be improved in the Netherlands from your side of view? Of course, you already showed 3 points, but
the challenge for me with saying that is that I was fortunate to visit the Netherlands twice. And in both instances, when an international visitor comes and starts asking to be shown things, you very kindly get shown all the good examples of things. So I have, I have good memories of going to a couple of water squares with you, a green roof somewhere, getting absolutely bucketed on with rain, trying to make a video with you in the pouring rain, if I remember correctly.
Hide in the car.
That's right. And I also remember, I've got this photograph that I absolutely love of what is essentially a bioretention system out the front of an apartment block or something, that was just really nicely integrated. So the honest answer is I've never seen anything done badly in the Netherlands to be able to reflect on it.
But there
I,
are.
yeah, I'm
that's
sure.
absolutely that's a good point actually. So next time, the third time that you come, we show you only bad examples.
Yeah,
What about that?
totally.
So we can learn from. And actually, we did a publication from Europe, exchanging examples to the UK and also Denmark, and with bad examples and what we can learn from it. Might be nice to exchange that. Also, really interesting in your guidelines. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, or maybe one time. I mean, this should actually be a heap of fun. We could do one of these chats where we each come with just a whole bunch of pictures of really bad assets, and we talk about them. we just share bad experiences and riff on them.
Absolutely.
Only
Let's
bad
do that.
examples. Yeah.
Only bad examples. Yeah.
Yeah. Sydney has a lot of them. No, over to you.
We do. I have enough. Yeah.
Any from your side? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was going to say I have a question, which is when you're building biofiltration systems in the Netherlands, what is the primary driver? Is it still the flood management driver, or is it a water quality driver like ours? Or I'm curious.
Yeah. Good point. Actually, you talk a lot about the quality, but I think the main thing in the Netherlands might be quantity. So preventing water from flooding homes, and of course bioretention, of course, quality improvement as well. But I think it's mostly about quantity in the Netherlands. Strangely enough. Yeah.
Okay. So that being the case, the filter media that you install in them, is it hospitable to plant growth? So because we're interested in quality, we try and install a filter media that really doesn't have much organics in it because we're concerned about leaching of nutrients out of the system as the organics break down. But if your primary focus is on water quantity, what's the filter media that you put in like? Because the bioretention system I remember seeing out front of the apartment block looked like it had almost the normal soil in it. So I'm curious.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there are guidelines in Netherlands as well. You have a filter layer of 30 to 50 centimeters, and that's mostly a bit of sand, but also regular soil. So basically, get the humus and lutum to have growth of plants. Otherwise, it will clog. So that again is more quantity, but it's also a quality layer. So there have been samples of the topsoil, and the heavy metals, of course, accumulate in that topsoil. So that's the filter layer as well. So basically quality is an issue as well, but it's basically a bit of both. So bioswales are quite very popular because of it's drought, it's flooding, and it's also because you keep the water in, but still it infiltrates. So it's about drought, it's about the storage volume you have, so it's about flooding. It's also about heat stress, so more green in the urban area, and it's about water quality. So probably those four are the main. But maybe Sydney, you can answer that better, coming from the municipality perspective and not as a researcher.
I think it's nice, a nice bridge, as we saved, to some of my questions that I had about the purpose of those bioswales, which we're talking about. Because, like Floor said, I think we have a lot of similar transitions. Also, what you're talking about, the budgets that still have to be arranged for all the maintenance. We are still working on that as well, and there is a big job coming to us in the Netherlands too, and it's mainly about the soil quality and the accumulation of pollutants, which is driving that. But for my municipality, it's interesting that there was a change in how we make those bioswales, because most of our bioswales in Nijmegen are just grass, plain, simple, boring grass. And what we also saw is that the organic or clay amount was pretty low. So it was mainly focused, as well as Flora said, on giving a good drainage. And what does work well on that kind of sand? Well, grass works pretty well on that kind of sand. But we're now more in a transition to now we can do other plants more as a garden, but also even parts that also were neglected, that we saw, well, this works pretty well, so we can arrange those bioswales as a more ecological system as well. But we're just really starting that. I think quite in a similar way that we have neglected areas and we see, well, this works pretty well, so why don't we do this in more places? Also that the maintenance can actually be made more easy if you let it go. But also because our purpose is starting to change a little bit, that the bioswale is still mainly made because of water retention and flood safety, but a lot of people from the green department and more the ecologists here are starting like, yeah, well, can't we make them with a bit more better soil? Can we enrich the soil with fungus, for example, like we try to do at our other more natural spaces? And we're trying to do that as well. So biodiversity starts to become another another driver, but really slowly, and mainly it's still the water retention. I think another driver to implement them is actually that it's that we are creating a space that doesn't get built on. We have actually really, if you go to the Netherlands and you have the chance to visit Nijmegen, we have this quite big for the Dutch for Dutch examples, quite big bioswales that are bioswales for water retention. But if there wasn't water retention, they would have been built on with houses, and everybody's really glad because now there are green areas. So it's a bit of it's the main will always be water retention, I think. Second, purification in the Netherlands, also in Nijmegen North. The main reason actually to make so many bioswales was because the water boards said, no, you have to make something that purifies the water. There wasn't really a standard of how much and how, and they were said bioswale, yeah, sounds fine. So we made them a lot. And I think those are have been the main drivers for a long time, but now some other ones are coming in. Yeah.
Cool. You know, something you said there when you were talking about that development with the what for the Netherlands are very large bioswales made me think of, oh, and you said that essentially people appreciate the retention of that green space and it not being built on. Made me think of something interesting that has started to happen here, which is that these days, for say the basin type bioretention systems or stormwater treatment wetlands that are, you know, anywhere from several hundred square meters up to, you know, several thousand square meters in size, depending on the scale of the development. They typically get built with pedestrian maintenance access either most of the way round or all the way around the system. So if you can imagine, I'll try and indicate this with my hands here, that we might have a waterway. This is a bird's eye view I'm trying to indicate here. A waterway, and we have the new urban development here. And the, let's say, bioretention system has been built between the two at the interface there. So we can treat the water before it gets to the waterway. There might be, I'll show it with this hand, a road along this side, but then maintenance access that skirts around the back of the system between the waterway and the bioretention system, and then back out to the road at this end. And it might only be, you know, a crushed rock path that's a meter or a meter and a half wide or something. But the number of people from the urban development who will then choose to go walking through there, even though it's maybe only 100 or 200 meters or something, will choose to, you know, on their afternoon walk, take that detour through that little pocket of bushland because it's just a nice setting. And, you know, we're not deliberately building those trails to try and encourage that, but the best designers are well and truly aware that that happens and are happy to facilitate it as a positive side effect of building the systems.
Yeah, as a positive side effect, exactly was that because that was one of the questions I had. You were talking about that you first made these biofuels for mostly gardens. That's also what we are doing. First, mostly grasslands. Now we're starting to make them more gardens and a little bit of ecosystems, but we also make them as use space. And exactly this example. For example, I'm designing biospheres myself. Now, if we have this example, we're like, yeah, well, we can also just make the maintenance path go through the biosphere, but then we have to make it a little bit bigger, make sure that the infiltration and the plants doesn't get crushed on by material that is passing. So we're basically changing the way it's used. And I was wondering if I mean the ecosystem is one of the example, but if you have like other examples that bioswales get like a different different function, at least different secondary function, um, compared to how it was implemented, because the ecosystem is basically a really great thing that developed over time and wasn't necessarily a goal to start with, I guess.
Yeah, although I would suggest that now that we've recognized that that happens, we are more deliberately, we're essentially being
Yeah.
like, oh, look, isn't this, it's the most resilient type, cheapest to maintain, and it also just has this really good benefit. We're literally in the process right now. I've been, um, for the past kind of 9 months or so, working on an update to our bioretention technical design guidelines. So I really briefly flicked that up on the screen at one point there. It was last updated in 2014. We're working on an update at the moment. But one of the key updates here is that we're going to, for these basin size systems, change the planting recommendations from what it currently says at the moment, which is you can put trees in them, but
Yeah.
up to you, to essentially say, if it's a basin type system, you
Mm,
shall treat it like an ecosystem unless you have a very
mm.
good reason not to. And there are some good reasons, like in some situations, depending on the landscape and what you're abutting to, there can be fire management risks associated with it. But we've just flipped that emphasis in the
Oh, that's
guideline to
nice.
say
Yeah.
default treat them like an ecosystem unless there's a
Yeah.
reason not to.
Yeah, for us it's still the other way around, and I'm hoping for it that we get to what you have right now. It's default still grass,
Yeah.
but you can plant trees in it, and often that happens, but more in a parkway, and you can make it more of an ecosystem. But yeah, that would be nice if we flip it around sometime too. Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
It's just, I mean, but my experience with that has essentially just been one of gradually over time,
Yeah.
we've become more comfortable with the idea to the point where we now feel comfortable to be like, okay, let's just make that change.
It
Um,
took me 4 years to make it normal to put plants to put trees in a biosphere. It was only one of my former colleagues, Antal Zurman, did it sometimes, but what was often frowned upon, and even my fellow sewer managers were like, "No, it's really problem for maintenance." So yeah, it takes
yeah.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even still, you'll still get resistance or at least questions about it for a long time. So for us, we didn't really ever go through a stage of many turf only systems. But as I said, we started with this understory only thing. And so when I joined the industry in 2010, the prevailing wisdom was, oh, you definitely can't put trees in a bioretention system because the
Yeah.
roots will get into the pipes at the bottom and block them. And then fortunately, a fellow Brad Dalrymple, who's a really passionate and energetic guy, arranged to go and CCTV all the underdrains of the systems that happened to have trees in them in Southeast Queensland at that time that we were aware of. It was about 10 systems, if I remember correctly. And they
Mm.
found no significant root intrusion in any of them. And that was enough for us to then change the guideline to say trees are okay, but not forcing your hand on it. And then, more than 10 years later, we're now like, okay, we see the trees actually have so many benefits, it has to be trees mandatory. But I still, literally 15 years later, run training courses and people will say, don't the tree roots block the under drains? And it's a completely fair question that I suspect I'm going to field for the rest of my working career. And that's fine. I'm happy to answer it.
You kind of already answered what I wanted to ask, but maybe just to follow up on that. So during the selection of different species for the establishment of these different vegetation areas and trees or what have you, you obviously would rather make use of endemic species, right? And would these species then be also selected to be more drought resilient because it is a biosphere, but obviously Australia also has heavy droughts. And that actually brings me to the question, you kind of mentioned that already, because you also mentioned, was it, I know it as wattles and gum trees. I'm not sure what the scientific word is, but they are quite prone to fires as well, right? And fire hazards, really. So would that be something, that type of vegetation be something that you would avoid planting in these areas to prevent them dying of drought and eventually becoming a fire hazard? Or how would you go about choosing the correct endemic species for these areas?
Yeah, cool. Okay, good question. There's a few different angles to approach this from. So the first thing I'd say in response to that is that you picked up on a really important point here. Because we're directing stormwater into these systems, people at least used to think about them as being a wet system first. But in fact, the bioretention system, particularly if you have relatively inhospitable filter media like we do, a bioretention system is primarily a really dry system that you know, semi-regularly gets very, very wet for a short period of time and then dries out again. So because of that, you really need to be selecting plants that respond to that wetting and drying regime. And often what that means is that the plants you want are the plants that would grow in the riparian area of a creek. So not in the waterway itself, but in maybe the first 10 meters of the bank that might have their roots tapping down into some groundwater or the like, but the plant itself is high and dry unless there's a flood. And so the species that we see doing most successfully in bioretention typically follow that pattern. So when, for example, I was showing the photos before of the Hoyland Street system that's 25 years old, and it has the paper barks in it, and the understory species is Lomandra longifolia, that's strappy-leafed green understory plant. You know, Lomandras grow anywhere from kind of the top of the creek bank out a fair way. They're pretty adaptable and resilient. And Melaleucas can grow in standing shallow water, but again, are really quite adaptable and can handle being quite a long way away. So there's an element of that. So definitely selecting for species that primarily can deal with being pretty dry, but can occasionally get really wet and don't mind. In terms of fire resilience, this is an emerging topic for us that with this guideline update, I've rapidly learned a bit about, but don't profess to be an expert on. But things that the primary thing that I learned, because I had a conversation about 2 weeks ago with a bushfire expert. If I remember correctly, his name is Anthony Power. I hope I'm getting that right. And he told me a few things essentially along the lines of, different species contributing to fuel loads in different ways. And I showed him examples of different species in bioretention, but also different connectivity. So and I think my takeaway from that conversation is fundamentally different species contribute to fuel loads in different ways, but it wasn't intuitive to what I would have expected as a layperson when it comes to fire. But also connectivity matters. So I showed him some systems that were beside bushland that I expected him to be like, oh, that's a fire risk sort of thing. And he was like, yeah, but it's not big enough bushland. Like a big fire is not going to get started in that bushland because it's actually a small pocket anyway. But then he showed me a different example where actually a bushfire 5, 6, 7 years ago had started in a really big pocket of bushland and had run through some bioretention systems amongst others. And he was like, look, in this situation, you know, it ran straight through those systems because XYZ sort of thing. So I suppose what I'm saying is I don't know enough to really answer that question, but it is an emerging topic here that I suspect we're likely to find out more about in the future. And the one other thing on plant selection that I'll then say is really a bit of a limitation from the research. So at the moment, our guideline says that from a treatment performance point of view, you've got to make sure that at least 50% of your plant cover is coming from a particular plant list. So a lot of our guidance still relies heavily on research done, you know, more than 15 years ago, a lot of it now by Monash University, who tested some native species in laboratory scale testing to see how good their treatment performance was, particularly for nitrogen removal. And so we have this kind of core list of plant species that are known to facilitate good nitrogen removal. And so our guidance says, look, at least 50% of your species has to come from that. And outside of the 50% or the other 50% of coverage can come from essentially anything you want. And that's okay because the research indicates if you have at least 50% coverage from well-performing species, you'll get good outcomes. But what that doesn't pick up on is that there are many, many dozens of species that haven't been tested. It doesn't pick on how different species might interact together. My gut feeling is that if you have a system planted with a diversity of species, even if some of those individually don't do good treatment performance, you're probably going to get better treatment just from the interactions between the plants. You know, there's a whole bunch we don't know there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And probably with that note, there's a lot of things we don't know yet. We probably have to call it a night.
Yeah.
Because it's 5:30, so overtime. Especially for you, Jack, you have to get some sleep. 1:30 in the morning. Thank you so much for keeping us widely awake, and with the 3 points of it was really, really amazing. And maybe next time we can really go into the detail, of course, of your guidelines and stuff. So maybe. Yeah, absolutely. Because well, knowing you, we can talk for hours.
Yeah, totally.
But totally. Absolutely, yeah. So for next week, we have Floating Villages by Matthias.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So stay tuned, I would say. But for now, thanks again, Jack. This was really amazing. And we catch up with the mapping and the guidelines. So thanks again, and everyone have a great night.
Awesome.
Thanks
for having me.
All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.